October 15th, 1968, 11:42 p.m. A narrow side street off 135th Harlem. The car was already idling when the gun came up. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back seat, hat low, coat buttoned, one hand resting on a folded envelope thick with cash. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't angry, he was tired. The kind of tired that comes after 20 years of watching men die for promises they couldn't keep. In the front passenger seat sat Eddie Carver, his bodyguard. Eddie had been with Bumpy for 3 years. He opened doors. He checked corners. He carried the gun so Bumpy didn't have to. Tonight, that gun was a .38 revolver tucked under Eddie's jacket. The same one Bumpy himself had handed him 6 months earlier. Eddie turned. Not all the way, just enough. The barrel cleared the seat. And for 1 second, exactly one, Harlem's most feared man was staring down his own protection. Eddie's voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson." That's the incident, a bodyguard, pointing a gun at the man who paid him, protected him, trusted him. Because Eddie believed that if he didn't pull the trigger, someone else would pull it on him. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment panic. And it wasn't about ego. It was about survival. Because earlier that night, Eddie Carver had been given a choice. Kill Bumpy Johnson or watch his younger brother die in a cell at Rikers before the week was out. The car's engine hummed. The street was empty. One streetlight flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay alive. Bumpy didn't reach for his own gun. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He looked at Eddie, really looked, and said one thing. "You're shaking." Eddie's hand was trembling so badly the muzzle wobbled. "Don't," Eddie whispered. "Don't talk." But Bumpy kept going. "Your finger's too tight." "That means fear? Not resolve?" The driver, a man named Louis, froze. His eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. He knew better than to move. If Eddie fired, the bullet would tear through the seat, through Bumpy's chest, and Harlem would wake up to a different future. Outside, footsteps echoed somewhere far off. A door slammed. Music drifted faintly from an upstairs window. A woman laughing, unaware that history was balancing on a trigger. Bumpy slowly raised both hands, palms open. "Who told you to do it?" he asked. Eddie swallowed. His jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he might actually pull the trigger just to make the question stop. Instead, he said, "They already know where my brother is." That was the danger, not the gun, not the street. Not even Bumpy Johnson. It was the fact that someone had gotten close enough to Eddie, close enough to his family, to turn loyalty into a liability. Bumpy nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion he'd been carrying longer than Eddie realized. Then Bumpy leaned forward and did something that made Eddie's breath catch. Something no one expected him to do in that car at that moment. He smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, but like a man who had just realized the game had changed, and that the person holding the gun might not be the one in control. Because Bumpy Johnson already knew who was behind this, and the real danger was still coming. So the question isn't whether Eddie pulled the trigger, it's why Bumpy didn't stop him. And what Bumpy decided instead. Eddie Carver wasn't supposed to be here. 3 years earlier, he was sleeping on a pull-out couch in a one-bedroom apartment on Lenox Avenue, sharing space with his kid brother Tommy. 22 years old, sharp smile, bad impulse control, and a habit of trusting the wrong people. Eddie was 31, a Korean War veteran, quiet, careful. He believed in routines because routines kept people alive. Tommy believed in shortcuts. That was the problem. Eddie worked days as a building porter and nights as muscle for a small numbers runner until a mutual friend introduced him to Bumpy Johnson's circle. Bumpy liked Eddie immediately, not because Eddie talked tough, but because he didn't talk at all. The first rule Bumpy gave him was simple. You don't gamble, you don't drink on the job, and your family stays invisible. Eddie followed every rule. Tommy didn't. Tommy started running errands for men who wore better suits and smiled too much. They paid in cash and promises. He liked both. Eddie warned him once, then twice. The third time, Eddie stopped asking questions, because questions led to answers, and answers led to funerals. Until the night Tommy didn't come home. 3 weeks before the gun came up in the car, Eddie got a call from a precinct desk sergeant he recognized. "Your brother's in holding," the man said. "Possession, not clean." Eddie went cold. Possession didn't just mean drugs. It meant leverage. Tommy sat behind the glass with a bruise blooming under his eye and fear pouring out of him. "They said they'd fix it," Tommy whispered. "They said it'd go away." Eddie didn't ask who they were, he already knew. Men tied to Vincent Chin Gigante had been circling Harlem quietly, pressing pressure points instead of firing guns. They didn't want a war. They wanted compliance. Tommy was a pressure point. 2 days later, Eddie was approached outside his building. No threats, no shouting, just a man with a neat tie and a polite voice. "Your brother's case can disappear," the man said, "or it can rot." Eddie said nothing. "All you have to do," the man continued, "is make sure Bumpy Johnson doesn't see Christmas." That was the choice. Eddie tried to find another way. He went to a lawyer. Too expensive. He went to a bail bondsman. Too slow. He thought about telling Bumpy and stopped himself cold. Because if Bumpy learned that Eddie's brother was compromised, Eddie wouldn't be fired. He'd be erased. And Tommy would still be in a cell. The final pressure came the night before the incident. Eddie visited Tommy again. This time, there was a guard standing closer than necessary. Tommy leaned in, voice shaking. "They told me you'd do the right thing." Eddie's stomach dropped. That meant the decision had already been communicated. The clock had started. That night, Eddie didn't sleep. He sat in a chair, gun on the table, staring at it, like it might answer him. He wasn't choosing between good and evil. He was choosing between blood and blood. The morning of October 15th, Bumpy called him in personally. "Ride with me tonight," Bumpy said. "Just you." That wasn't normal. Eddie nodded. He checked the revolver. He loaded it. He holstered it. Every step after that felt borrowed. Now, in the idling car on that side street, Eddie felt the full weight of it crush his chest. Tommy's face, the man's polite smile, Bumpy's calm voice. The gun was up. The future was narrow, and Eddie realized too late that no matter what he chose next, he was going to lose someone. The only question was who, and whether Bumpy Johnson already knew the answer. Because the smile Bumpy gave him in that car wasn't fear. It was recognition. And recognition meant Eddie wasn't as far ahead as he thought. Bumpy didn't move his hands. He didn't raise his voice either. That's what made it worse. The car sat there breathing, engine low, streetlight flickering, the driver stiff as stone. Eddie's arms were burning from holding the gun steady, but he didn't lower it. Lowering it would mean choosing. And Eddie wasn't ready to choose yet. "You're thinking about timing," Bumpy said calmly. "About where the bullet goes." Eddie clenched his jaw. "Stop." "If you shoot," Bumpy continued. You'll aim center mass. That's what you were taught. But your wrist is off. You'll hit high. Eddie's eyes watered. He hated that Bumpy was right. I said, stop talking. Bumpy leaned back slightly, careful not to startle him. Who spoke to you first? Bumpy asked. Was it the one with the neat tie or the one who doesn't blink? Eddie's breath hitched. That wasn't a guess. The neat tie was the messenger. The one who didn't blink was the closer. Eddie had seen both. Bumpy exhaled through his nose. They always send two. One to make it sound clean, one to make it sound final. The driver swallowed hard. Eddie felt something ugly crawl up his spine. This wasn't a man discovering betrayal. This was a man confirming it. You think you're early, Bumpy said. You're not. Eddie's voice broke. They have my brother. Bumpy nodded. I know. The word hit harder than any punch. You... No? I knew before tonight, Bumpy said. I knew before you loaded that gun. Eddie's finger tightened involuntarily. Then why am I still breathing? Bumpy's eyes lifted, locking onto Eddie's. Because if I was wrong about you, Bumpy said, you'd already be dead. Silence stretched. Somewhere, a siren wailed and faded. Bumpy shifted just enough to reach into his coat. Slowly, deliberately, and Eddie almost fired. Instead, Bumpy pulled out a folded piece of paper and placed it on the seat between them. It was a visitor log. Rikers Island, Tommy Carver. 3 names signed in the past week. None of them were Eddie. You didn't know about the third man, Bumpy said. That's the problem. Eddie stared at the paper. I checked, he whispered. I went twice. They didn't bring him out, Bumpy replied, because they wanted you desperate. Eddie's stomach dropped. Who was the third? Bumpy finally lowered his hands. Someone who wanted to make sure your brother didn't talk. The implication landed heavy. They're not planning to let him go? Eddie said, realization dawning. Even if I do this. Bumpy said nothing. That was answer enough. Eddie's arm began to shake harder now, not from fear of Bumpy, but from the collapse of the lie he'd been clinging to. The promise had been false from the start. You kill me, Bumpy said quietly, and they still bury your brother, because loose ends make men nervous. The gun dipped an inch. Eddie felt sick. Bumpy leaned forward again, voice low. But if you don't, they'll come for him faster. Eddie snapped his head up. So what do I do? That was the real question. Not whether Eddie would betray Bumpy, but whether betrayal was already the least damaging option left. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. Then he said, You listen, and you don't flinch. Bumpy reached under the seat. The driver gasped. Eddie's gun snapped back up. Bumpy came up holding another revolver. He placed it gently on the seat. Unloaded. I want you to understand something, Bumpy said. This car ride, this isn't the move. Eddie frowned. Then what is? Bumpy's gaze hardened. This is the test. Outside, footsteps stopped near the end of the block. Voices murmured. Too close. Bumpy's eyes flicked to the street, then back to Eddie. They're watching, he said, and in about 30 seconds they're going to expect to hear a shot. Eddie's pulse slammed in his ears. If I don't fire, he said, they'll know. Bumpy nodded once. And if you do, he said, you'll belong to them forever. The footsteps were closer now. A shadow passed under the streetlight. Eddie realized the trap wasn't just the gun, it was time. And whatever happened next would decide who owned his future and whether his brother had one at all. So when Eddie made his next move, it wasn't the one anyone was expecting. Eddie did not pull the trigger. Instead, he did something worse. He fired the gun straight down. The blast inside the car was deafening. The windshield didn't shatter. Bumpy didn't flinch. The bullet punched through the floorboard and screamed into the asphalt beneath them. For half a second, the world froze. Then the footsteps outside stopped. A voice hissed, "That's it." The shadow under the streetlight moved back. Bumpy's eyes never left Eddie. "Good," Bumpy said quietly. "Now they think you chose." Eddie's hands were numb. His ears rang. Smoke curled inside the car, thick and bitter. "I just told them I killed you," Eddie whispered. "No," Bumpy replied. "You told them you fired. There's a difference." The driver finally spoke, voice shaking. "They're coming." Bumpy nodded. "Of course they are." He reached down and rapped twice on the divider between the front and back seats, a signal Eddie had never seen him use before. The engine revved. Not forward, backward. The car lurched in reverse just as two men stepped into the street, guns already out. They weren't surprised. They weren't rushing. That was the reveal Eddie hadn't prepared for. "They knew," Eddie said. "They suspected," Bumpy corrected. "Suspicion makes men sloppy." The car slammed to a stop. The driver cut the engine. Silence fell heavy again. One of the men outside approached the rear door. He knocked once, casually, like this was a scheduled meeting. "Mr. Johnson," the man called. "You okay in there?" Bumpy didn't answer. Eddie's pulse hammered. "If they open that door—" "They won't," Bumpy said. Another knock. Louder. Eddie realized something then, and something chilling. These men weren't here to confirm Bumpy's death. They were here to confirm Eddie's loyalty. The door handle rattled. Bumpy leaned in close to Eddie, voice barely audible. "They don't want my body," he said. "They want to see your face." Eddie's mouth went dry. "And if they see me alive," he whispered, "then your brother dies tonight." The handle stopped moving, a pause. Then the man outside spoke again, tone polite but sharper now. "Eddie, step out." Bumpy's eyes hardened. "This is the moment," he said. "Fear or respect?" Eddie laughed once, a broken sound. "Respect from who?" Bumpy didn't answer. Instead, he did the last thing Eddie expected. He reached out and shoved the unloaded revolver back into Eddie's hand. "You step out," Bumpy said, "with my gun." Eddie stared at him. "That makes no sense." "It does if you understand the play," Bumpy replied. "They think you just proved yourself. Now you finish it." Eddie's stomach twisted. "You want me to point this at you?" "I want you to point it at them," Bumpy said. "But not yet." The silence outside stretched thin. "Eddie," the man called again, "don't make this difficult." Eddie opened the door. Cold air hit his face. Streetlight glare burned his eyes. Two men stood there, both armed, both calm. The neat tie was gone. This was business now. Eddie stepped out slowly, gun in hand. "Where's Mr. Johnson?" one of them asked. Eddie didn't answer immediately. He turned slightly, just enough that they could see into the car. Bumpy sat there, unharmed. The men tensed. "That wasn't the agreement," the taller one said. Eddie swallowed. "He moved." The shorter man smiled thinly. "Then move him again." That's when Eddie understood. There was no next step, no backup plan, no mercy clause. They were never going to let him walk away. Bumpy's voice carried from the car, steady and sharp. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're early." Both men turned, startled. "You should have waited for the signal," Bumpy continued. "Now you've shown your hand." The taller man scoffed. You think this ends well for you? No, Bumpy said. I think it ends honestly. Eddie felt it before he saw it. Headlights flooding the street from both ends. 2 cars, fast, no plates. The men outside spun, too late. Doors flew open, guns came out. But these weren't Gigante's men, they were Bumpy's. The street exploded into motion, shouting, scrambling, weapons raised. One of the men dove, the other froze, eyes wide, realizing the trap had closed around him instead. Eddie stood in the middle of it, gun still in his hand, heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Bumpy stepped out of the car behind him. You see, Bumpy said calmly, this was never about whether you'd betray me. He placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder, firm, grounding. It was about who you'd betray for. One of the men was disarmed and on his knees. The other lay bleeding, screaming for help that wasn't coming. Eddie turned to Bumpy, shaking. My brother, he said. Tommy. Bumpy's face didn't soften. That, he said, is the part you're not going to like. Eddie's breath caught, because if this had all been a test, then the real cost was still waiting. And whatever Bumpy had done next, he had done it before Eddie ever raised the gun, which meant the choice Eddie thought he made might not have been his at all. The street went quiet fast, not peaceful, controlled. Bumpy's men worked with efficiency, not anger. Weapons were taken, pockets checked. No speeches, no celebrating. Just containment. Eddie stood there uselessly, the gun hanging heavy in his hand. My brother, he said again. Where is he? Bumpy didn't answer right away. He watched his men finish their work, then gestured for Eddie to follow him back toward the car. That's when Eddie knew something was wrong. They weren't going toward the cars at the end of the block. They were going the opposite direction. Bumpy, Eddie said, voice tight. You said you knew? I did, Bumpy replied. That's why I acted early. Early. The word felt like a blade. They stopped beside a black sedan Eddie didn't recognize. One of Bumpy's men opened the door. Inside was a man Eddie had never seen before. Late 40s, gray at the temples, hands cuffed behind his back. The third visitor. The one from the log. This is the man who went to see your brother, Bumpy said. Twice. The man lifted his head just enough to sneer. He was never getting out, he said. You should have known that. Eddie lunged forward, but 2 men grabbed his arms. Where's Tommy? Eddie shouted. The man shrugged, moved him. The word landed like a gunshot. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Moved him where? Bumpy asked. The man smiled wider. Somewhere quiet. That's when Bumpy turned away, not in anger, in disappointment. He snapped his fingers once. A shot rang out. The man slumped forward, lifeless. Eddie screamed, fighting the hands holding him. You said you acted early, Eddie yelled. You said you knew. Bumpy faced him again, eyes hard. I did, he said. I knew they were going to use your brother. I didn't know how far they'd already gone. Eddie's legs gave out. He sagged against the car. He was alive, Eddie whispered. This morning I saw him. Bumpy's voice dropped. And now you don't know. The truth settled in slowly, crueler than certainty. There would be no body to bury, no grave to visit, just a missing man swallowed by a system designed to erase people. Eddie had chosen not to pull the trigger. He had chosen loyalty, and still he had lost the one thing he was trying to save. Bumpy crouched in front of him. You didn't fail him, Bumpy said. They did. Eddie laughed, a hollow, broken sound. That doesn't bring him back. No, Bumpy replied, but it tells me something. He stood. From this moment on, Bumpy said, you don't work doors anymore. Eddie looked up, eyes red. Then what am I? Bumpy's answer was quiet. You're proof. Proof of what? Eddie didn't know yet. All he knew was that survival had a price, and it wasn't always paid by the man holding the gun. And somewhere out there, his brother's fate was still unresolved, which made the ending far worse than death. By morning, the story on the street was already wrong. They said Bumpy Johnson had sniffed out a hit and turned it inside out. They said 2 men disappeared off 135th like they'd never existed. They said someone close to Bumpy had been tested and passed. No one said how close. Eddie didn't leave the apartment Bumpy put him in for 3 days. No windows, no phone, just a chair, a table, and the echo of that single shot in his head. When Bumpy finally came, he didn't bring guards. He brought paperwork, Riker's transfer requests, court dockets, names circled in red. Your brother didn't die that night, Bumpy said, placing the files down. That man lied to save himself. Eddie's chest tightened. Then where is he? Moved into federal custody, Bumpy replied. Not by them, by someone who saw leverage and took it. Eddie frowned. The feds? Bumpy nodded once. They were already sniffing around. Your brother ran errands for the wrong men at the wrong time. Hope crept in, dangerous, fragile. So he's alive? For now, Bumpy said, but he's not yours anymore. That was the aftershock no one warned him about. Tommy wasn't dead. He was gone, protected by the very system Eddie had spent his life avoiding, and untouchable to everyone Eddie knew. If I go to him, Eddie began. You won't, Bumpy cut in. If you do, he loses that protection, and you lose what little ground you have left. Eddie sat back, hollowed out. Outside, Harlem adjusted. Men who had been waiting to see weakness saw something else instead. Patience. Calculated restraint. The kind that made sudden moves feel dangerous. Gigante's people didn't retaliate. They reorganized. That told Bumpy everything he needed to know. They're pulling back, Eddie said quietly. For now, Bumpy replied, which means something else is coming. Eddie looked at the files again. What do I do? Bumpy studied him. You live, he said, and you listen. To who? To the space between things, Bumpy answered. That's where the next move hides. Eddie realized then what proof meant. He wasn't a guard anymore. He wasn't family. He wasn't expendable. He was a message, a reminder that pressure didn't always break the way it was supposed to, and that using family as leverage could backfire in ways no one could control. As Bumpy stood to leave, Eddie spoke. If they come for him again, they won't, Bumpy said, not while I'm breathing. It wasn't reassurance, it was a statement of fact. And for the first time since that night, Eddie understood the real shift that had happened. Not on the street, but inside the rules themselves. Because everyone learned something from that failed hit, and the ones who learned the wrong lesson would pay for it next. Eddie Carver never saw his brother again. Years later, a name would surface in a sealed court transcript, a cooperating witness relocated under a different identity, testimony that quietly dismantled 2 crews and vanished into federal storage. No reunions, no thank you, just distance. Eddie stayed in Bumpy Johnson's orbit, but never close enough to touch the center again. He became the man who noticed patterns before others did, the man who heard rumors early and spoke late. He lived longer that way. Bumpy, for his part, never mentioned the night on 135th again. But once, just once, Eddie heard him say something that stuck. "Men think the gun is the decision," Bumpy said. "It isn't. The decision comes before the gun ever clears the coat." That was the irony. Eddie hadn't chosen violence or mercy. He'd chosen truth, and still paid for it with absence. Harlem didn't remember Eddie's name. History rarely does. But a single second, a gun fired into asphalt instead of flesh, redirected lives, investigations, and alliances in ways no one could see at the time. Not because it made a legend, but because it left a space where a body should have been, and forced everyone to live with what filled that space instead. If you want more true crime stories where one human choice quietly rewrites the outcome, subscribe, because sometimes the moment that changes everything is the one where no one dies.